So the project on the art and science of using evidence is probably one of our most long-standing initiatives, and personally also one that's most dearest to my heart. In it, we're trying to understand what works to increase the use of evidence. And we started that because it came out of a really awkward situation where we as evidence advocates tell others, particularly in government, to use evidence. Don't do a policy until you have an evaluation result in or a synthesis in. But then when we look at our own work, like when we design an intervention, capacity building for evidence use, or building a new community of practice for evidence use, we don't look at the best available evidence ourselves. So it's really awkward to preach to people to use evidence, but then we're not practicing the same. So that's where the idea for the art and science of evidence use came from. And essentially since 2017, we've been mapping all the available evidence that looks at interventions supporting the use of evidence. And we've kept that evidence base live. And it's amazing how it's been growing. And it's been really exciting how Zafeer and his team have taken over the project in the last 18 months and moved it to the next level. So looking forward to hearing more on that from Zafeer now.
Hi, my name is Zafeer Ravat. I'm the Director of Programs and Impact, and I'll be talking about our project on the art and science of evidence use, and more specifically the evidence map called the Art and Science of Evidence-Informed Policymaking, a global evidence map. And yeah, I think it's a project I've been working on for now, what is close to a year and a half. Really excited about it. And yeah, my role so far has been to lead much of the research as well as other areas of the project. And yeah, with me I have Tanya.
Hi, I'm Tanya Mdlalose. I work as a researcher at PACE, and I was part of the research production and the research activities working together with Zafeer on the Arts and Science Evidence Map.
I think you're being humble, Tanya. Tanya has been key in managing the overall activities for the project and also keeping the map updated. She's been supporting all the research steps involved and also, really just helping us frame kind of how to develop the map and how to improve different areas of it. So I think that's been really nice. Part of the work that we've been, it is so nice to collaborate together. And part of it is just kind of understanding what it means, for the map and what it means to you. And I know we've discussed this a couple of times, but yeah, it would be good to get a sense kind of from your perspective, how do you see the evidence map itself?
Yeah, it's quite nice that you use the word humble, because there's nothing humble about this map. It's quite a large body of work I think we had over 100,000 citations that we actually worked around. And I think the significance of this map and what it represents for me, it's the fact that it not only represents and reflects a rigorous body of work, but it also feeds into information and evidence that actually has influence in evidence policy making, and that can actually impact people at that level of decision making. And to a certain extent, I can say different stakeholders, meaning your knowledge users and your knowledge producers, and the fact that we as knowledge brokers can impact on that and have an influence in that type of body of work it's quite humbling.
No, I hear you. There is nothing humble. I think currently it sits at 940 studies. It's been a major effort. I think predating me. Of course, I know you've been working a long time on it. You know what I mean. So it's been really a major effort to grow this evidence base, and I think part of it was just that a lot of a lot of research done on evidence-informed policymaking initiatives, was quite fragmented, and the evidence map itself kind of brings it all together in a way that is curated, and we now have kind of a visual representation, which I really like. Right, is you have a visual representation of how the studies are distributed across interventions and outcomes, which Tanya will discuss a bit more in detail, right, on interventions, targeted evidence-informed policy making, and what works. So I think that's been really, really nice to see, and I think just overall, right, there's an area of this map that it kind of fills as a tool. more than anything, right, to support evidence use communities on a whole. I think irrespective of, the nature or the use, I think having an overview or having a database that is curated and organized in a way and really specific to what works, is really nice to have, and I think as a tool to support the overall goal of ensuring that evidence use does happen and evidence-informed policymaking is a reality. And yeah, in terms of how we kind of got this really nice big map with 940 studies, I think we do follow a systematic review approach. So to identifying literature and the steps, so we go through a very rigorous approach. We have a search strategy that we use to apply to academic databases, and I think another really nice component that we look at is also grey literature, which we've kind of honed and are continuously developing to be more refined in identifying relevant literature. And I think one of the questions I often get is kind of what is the art in science, and basically kind of how we look at it, is the art of evidence of evidence use really is the more tacit knowledge that comes from working in dynamic environments and research that kind of follows that pathway. And I think the science is a bit more applicable linear approaches, right? And I think through that we kind of do searches and identify studies and then map them according to an intervention and outcome framework. And I think fundamentally the theory is based around a COM-B framework, and I think some of the details, Tanya, maybe you can enlighten us since you're super familiar with.
Yeah, thank you, Zafeer. So these framework of interventions and our outcomes, we actually differentiated the interventions into 6 impacts of change interventions, right, groups, which speak into awareness. Do these people that are involved, are they actually aware? Are the policymakers aware of this evidence? The access to evidence, also a very important one, interaction between policymakers and researchers. Is there evidence that says that policymakers and decision makers are actually interacting with researchers who are actually knowledge brokers and some of them knowledge producers? Is it getting to the right people? And also very important, skills and capacity building, evidence that speaks around that. And also lastly, structures and processes. Do we have interventions that feed into evidence decision making, that feeds into structures and processes that actually has an impact on policy making? And with our outcome measures, we were looking at outcome measures between the capability. Do people have the capability, the knowledge? Do they have the emotional understanding to actually interact with this evidence to a certain extent? And also opportunity. Sometimes you find that the evidence is out there, but the opportunity is not presented to people being able to interact with evidence at a scale that will impact policy. And lastly, the motivation to use evidence. We look at this at also organizational levels, that are the people that are supposed to be interacting with this evidence and actually being the one who are decision makers motivated? Are they encouraged to actually use this evidence that is being produced and is actually out there for accessibility? So those are some of the outcome measures and interventions of mechanisms of change that we looked into.
Thanks. And I think like those are really nice conceptually, right? And then we also look at downstream impacts, which is really interesting, right? Because I think a lot of the interventions happen at one level, and then kind of to trace it all the way down, like, is always kind of a challenge. So I think that's also one of the areas that we looked at. The findings or areas that we've identified, like there are quite a few areas in the actual map that do have a bit of saturation. I think awareness is one that does have a lot of primary studies. So I think there are definitely opportunities for synthesis in some areas. I think, of course, I think the structures in evidence-informed policymaking, like interventions that kind of aim to develop different structures, that is an area that is a gap.
Yes.
And I think there were some other really interesting insights.
Yes, those interesting insights to see that from what we had from 2015, there's been like a huge trend of like more evidence being found there. Like there's a huge evidence growing within the evidence decision-making space. So that's a very comforting idea or comforting area of understanding. And also the interaction between policymakers and researchers, meaning the different stakeholders, we are seeing evidence growing there largely. So that means there's huge collaboration around ideas and also action around putting theory into practice of evidence decision making. So that's really was a good thing to see what the evidence was telling us when we were looking at the map.
Yep, I think, just the focus of interventions targeting interaction, I think has been really, has been a trend that we've been seeing more and more. And I think almost half our studies are from 2015 onwards. And like we go all the way back. So yeah, I think it's been really nice to see. And there's been a continuous growth. I think that's also a nice thing. I think actually there's been a continuous growth all through every year. We do see that the percentage or number of studies that we are adding are getting larger. And I think some nice other areas there is also regionally, we're seeing initially, I think a lot of the literature prior to 2020, or even later years, actually 2022, a lot of the literature was focused on more global north areas, and I think now there's been some trends that we are seeing that are changing, which are encouraging as well. I think one of it is also just in the geographic spread, right?
Interestingly enough, we've been seeing a shift of evidence being produced from the global north to the global south, that there's actually now more evidence within the global south region, which is very interesting and quite motivating in terms of
Being from the global south.
yes,
right?
being from the global south and actually having evidence that also is a representation of inclusivity around the region as well.
Yep. And I think it is definitely an encouraging trend. And we see a similar one even in sectors. So a lot of literature of the baseline is still largely dominated by global north countries, and similarly with health. But the trends we are starting to see trends both that, the evidence base is becoming a bit more heterogeneous, which I think does show that there's more interest across the board. And as we reflect on all these things, it's good to kind of understand what is the importance of the map itself. And I must say, like, I think before I kind of took on the project itself, it was already an existing database that was really, had a lot of momentum and had a lot of growth. And I must be frank, right? It's something that I think took me a bit of time to understand the actual significance, but really there is just so much evidence all around, right? And I think to make sure that, the processes are there and there are interventions on what works, right, to target evidence use in particular for policymaking, I think is really important for the entire community. And what the evidence map represents is just that, right? We do have lots of knowledge and we do have opportunities to facilitate it. And I think that's kind of where it really helps. It helps, knowledge producers in identifying areas where we might need more research, funders for identifying areas that are gaps in the type of research needed for any area. And also, I think just as someone out of pure interest, of just reading literature based on the art and science of evidence-informed policymaking. I think those are kind of really areas that speak out to me in terms of its significance. How about you?
Yeah, I think that's a very major one. It's also having an evidence that is accessible. So the living evidence map is exactly that. It's accessible and it's also relevant and also time-based. It's not always outdated. If you're looking for evidence that is around 2025, it's sitting there, you can access it. So I think also as someone who's very much into the short film and short fast things of these days in social media, it's very nice to have something that is very much relevant and time-based and current. So that actually feeds into evidence that is actually being used and practiced and is actually relevant to the people that need to be relevant to. Yeah.
And I think we did, it was really nice to keep it living, right? Like the cadence of quarterly updates. But we were also able, because historically there's been so much work on it, we were able to leverage a lot of AI to facilitate some of the processes like screening, because we had a lot of screening data. So now I think we're at a position where, it's easier, quicker and faster to keep the map updated. And then I think another really nice thing that came up through like sustainability, right, is, you know, this has been something that has been through PACE since 2017. And of course, as I just mentioned earlier, you know, we do have ways to kind of update it more quickly with being less resource heavy. But also, I think we've also been able to, you know, get in touch and work with different organizations, right, to provide us literature that otherwise will be really difficult to get, such as like gray literature for certain organizations. I think that was one really nice thing that kind of came up. And this helped us kind of enhance our gray literature approach. So we have organizations sharing us research that they think might be relevant to the map, and then we review them. And through this process, we have been able to add we've been able to add quite a few studies to the map as well. And yeah, I think really just working on the map, you know, on a whole, that's been one area that I've learned a lot. Is just, you know, there is a lot of knowledge, you know, it's just kind of being a bit more creative in terms of trying to get it. That is the one area. And I think coming from, again, you know, coming from a place where I wasn't too familiar with the evidence base, a really big learning for me has just been the importance of this evidence base in supporting evidence-informed policy making, and also just the general movement around increasing evidence use.
I think that's very important because it touches on that part of having fragmentation within the evidence. It actually deals with it nicely, that you have grey literature evidence that feeds into combating that fragmenting parts of what we have around evidence decision making. So that was a very, very nice highlight of interacting with that within the evidence map. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.